In 1971, a woman named Edna Combs in Harlan County, Kentucky, set out 3 cast iron skillets on a wood-burning stove at 5 in the afternoon and started frying. Her husband was 45 minutes from home. Her 3 boys were already at the kitchen table. There was no starter course, no appetizer plate the way they talk about in restaurants. There was just whatever came out of the skillet first, and you ate it standing up if you could not wait. Edna did not call it an appetizer. She called it something to hold you over. And every woman in that holler knew exactly what she meant. These were not the appetizers of restaurants or cookbooks. They were the small, brilliant things that mountain and country families across the South made from scraps and garden harvests and wild forage because supper was still 20 minutes away, and the hunger in that kitchen was not willing to wait. They have been laughed at. They have been forgotten, and every single one of them tasted better than anything a restaurant has put on a plate in the last 50 years. Number 19 on this list was so tied to coal mining communities in West Virginia that food historians found it in over 200 handwritten recipe cards from the same county. Number 11 fed more Appalachian children through lean winters than any government program ever did. And number 1, the appetizer that country mothers across Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Carolinas made with 3 ingredients and no recipe at all, has been so completely forgotten that most people under 60 have never tasted it and never will. These 25 forgotten hillbilly appetizers nourished country families through the 1970s. Before fast food convinced an entire generation that hunger was something you drove to fix, these were what filled the gap. If you grew up in a kitchen that smelled like lard and cornmeal and wood smoke, this list is yours. Hit subscribe right now and ring the bell. Every week on this channel, we bring back one more piece of the kitchen that America forgot. And you do not want to miss a single one. Number 25, hush puppies, cornmeal, an egg, a little onion, salt, and enough buttermilk to bring the batter together. Dropped by the spoonful into a skillet of hot lard and fried until the outside was dark gold and the inside was soft and faintly sweet. They cost almost nothing. They took 7 minutes, and they disappeared from the table before anything else did. The name came from cooks, throwing them to barking dogs to keep them quiet while supper finished. They were not scraps. They were the best thing on the table. Country families knew it. The dogs knew it too. Number 24, fried green tomatoes. In late summer, before the tomatoes had time to ripen, mountain families sliced them thick, dredged them in seasoned cornmeal, and fried them in bacon grease until the coating was crisp and the inside was tart and yielding. A pound of green tomatoes cost nothing if you grew them yourself, which everyone did. They were served before supper as something to pick at, standing at the counter while the beans finished. Tart, salty, crunchy, and gone in minutes. The restaurant version that appeared in the 1990s is a polished copy of something that had been on hillbilly tables for 100 years, before anyone thought to put it on a menu. Number 23, pan-fried okra, sliced into coins, tossed in salted cornmeal, and fried in a cast iron skillet until each piece had a crust that shattered when you bit into it, and a center that was tender and almost sweet. Okra was a garden staple across the rural South and Appalachia because it grew in heat and poor soil without much help. Mothers fried it fast in small batches as the family gathered, and it disappeared from the bowl so quickly that a second batch usually followed the first. The okra that comes frozen and pre-breaded from a grocery store bag is a distant, sad relative of the real thing. Number 22, hoe cakes, a batter of cornmeal, salt, and water, nothing else in the oldest versions, cooked in a cast iron skillet greased with lard until each cake had a dark, crackling crust on both sides. Field workers had cooked them on the flat blade of a hoe over an open fire for generations before they moved to the stovetop. They cost so little to make that the cost was essentially zero. They came out of the skillet hot and were eaten with butter or sorghum, or just the heat of your own hands. Simple food made by people who understood that simple and good were often the same thing. Number 21, crackling cornbread bites. When a hog was butchered and the fat was rendered down, the crispy bits of pork skin left in the pot were called cracklings. Nothing was wasted. Mothers folded them into cornbread batter, poured it into a hot skillet, and baked small rounds that came out dense, savory, and rich with the flavor of the pork fat distributed through every bite. A food historian at the University of Tennessee found crackling cornbread in more Appalachian community cookbooks than any other single recipe. It was poverty cooking that tasted like abundance. It has almost completely disappeared. Number 20, corn pone wedges, thicker and denser than cornbread, made with white cornmeal and water and salt, and shaped by hand into rounds or wedges before being baked directly on the cast iron. No eggs, no milk, no leavening in the oldest versions, just meal and water, and heat and patience. The crust that formed on the cast iron was hard and dark, and the inside was compact and filling. Corn pone fed Appalachian families through lean months when nothing else was available. It required nothing but corn. That was the genius of it. The simplest things fed the most people. Number 19, Shucky beans with salt pork. Green beans threaded onto string and hung from the rafters to dry through summer and fall, then rehydrated in winter and cooked low and slow with a piece of salt pork until the beans were silky and the broth was deep and savory and smoky. In West Virginia alone, food historians found this preparation in over 200 handwritten recipe cards from the same county, Mingo County, where coal miners' wives had been making Shucky beans since the 1890s, served in small bowls before supper as the pot simmered. The smell that came off that pot when you lifted the lid was the smell of winter in Appalachia. Warm, safe, gone. Number 18, fried ramps. Ramps are wild leeks that push through the forest floor in early spring across the Appalachian Mountains, and their arrival was treated as a genuine event. The first green thing after a long winter, dug from the hillside, washed and fried in bacon grease until wilted and caramelized. They smelled extraordinary and tasted of garlic and onion, and something deeper and earthier that had no name. Mountain schools gave children the day off for ramp festivals. Communities gathered around them. Fried ramps were set on the table before supper was ready, and everyone stood around the skillet eating them with their fingers. Spring tasted like this. Number 17, succotash, lima beans and corn cooked together with butter and salt, and sometimes a splash of cream, finished with black pepper. It was a dish that came from Native American cooking and traveled through Appalachian and Southern kitchens for 3 centuries before anyone started calling it old-fashioned. In summer, When both the corn and the beans came in at once, it appeared on country tables almost daily. It was served in small bowls as something to eat, while the main dish finished. Sweet and starchy and satisfying in the way only simple food made from fresh ingredients can be. Not a recipe, a season. Number 16, bean soup sippers, the liquid left at the bottom of a pot of cooked beans, what Southern cooks called pot liquor, was poured into cups and drunk while supper was being plated. It was salty and smoky from the ham hock, and rich with the starch of the beans and the fat that had cooked into it over hours. Children drank it like broth. Adults drank it to tide themselves over. It cost nothing because it was a byproduct of something already on the stove. The idea of throwing it away would have seemed genuinely wasteful to any mountain cook. Pot liquor was not a leftover. It was a course. Number 15, pickled green beans. Green beans packed into mason jars with garlic, dill, red pepper flakes, and a brine of vinegar and salt, then sealed and left in the root cellar for 3 weeks. When you opened a jar, the beans were still crisp, but had taken on the sourness of the brine and the heat of the pepper and the fragrance of the dill in a way that made them taste completely different from the cooked version. Set on the table in a dish before supper as something to pick at, tart and cold and sharp. Mountain pantries lined with jars of pickled beans meant the family would eat through winter. Every jar was a decision made in summer that paid off in February. Number 14, hot water cornbread patties. Cornmeal mixed with nothing but boiling water and salt until it formed a stiff dough, then shaped into small patties by hand and fried in hot grease until dark and crisp on both sides. The boiling water partially cooked the cornmeal before it ever touched the skillet, which gave these patties a texture that no other cornbread method could replicate. Dense and almost chewy inside with a crust that was genuinely hard. They were made fast while something else finished cooking and eaten immediately, often directly from the skillet. The simplest food made by the most skilled hands. Number 13, grits bites. Leftover grits from breakfast, cooled until firm in a pan, then sliced into squares or rounds and fried in butter or lard until a golden crust formed on each side. They came out of the skillet crispy outside and soft inside and tasted of the corn and the butter and the salt from the morning before. Nothing was wasted in a hillbilly kitchen. Yesterday's grits became today's appetizer. The transformation that happened between cold leftover and hot fried cake was not a trick or a technique. It was the daily practice of people who understood that good cooking was mostly about paying attention to what you already had. If this is bringing back memories of a kitchen you grew up in, hit subscribe right now. Every week we go back to the table that America forgot. You do not want to miss what's coming next. Number 12, fatback on cornbread. A thin slice of salt-cured fatback laid on top of a square of hot cornbread and left there for 30 seconds until the fat began to melt into the bread. That was it. That was the whole preparation. The fat soaked into the cornbread, and the cornbread absorbed it. And what came out was something that tasted far richer and more complicated than its 2 ingredients had any right to produce. It was the appetizer of the very poor, made from the cheapest cut of pork and the most basic bread. It was also extraordinary. Mountain families ate it while supper finished because they could not wait. Neither can you once you have tasted it. Number 11, skillet-fried cornmeal mush. Cornmeal cooked with water and salt until thick, then poured into a pan to set overnight. In the morning, the mush was firm enough to slice. Those slices went into a hot skillet with lard and fried until a dark crust formed on both sides, eaten with sorghum or bacon grease or just salt. Through lean Appalachian winters, cornmeal mush fed more children than any other single food. A food historian documented it in the diets of coal mining families across 3 states as the most reliable source of calories when wages did not come. It has been so thoroughly erased from the American table that most people under 50 have never seen it made. Number 10, chow chow relish on crackers. A relish made from green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, peppers, and vinegar, cooked down and canned in late summer from the last of the garden before the first frost. Bright, sharp, sweet, and acidic all at once, spooned onto saltine crackers and eaten while supper cooked. Every family had a different recipe. Every family believed theirs was the correct one. Chow chow appeared on Appalachian tables year-round because the jars lasted through winter, and a cracker with chow chow cost almost nothing to produce and tasted like the garden preserved at its peak. The last commercial version of chow chow worth eating disappeared from grocery shelves sometime in the 1980s. The homemade version has almost gone with it. Number 9, pickled beets and onions. Beets roasted or boiled until tender, sliced, and packed into jars with thin sliced onions and a brine of cider vinegar, sugar, and salt. The beets turn the onions the color of garnets. The whole jar sat in the root cellar for 2 weeks before it was opened. When it was, the beets were deeply sweet and sour, and the onions had absorbed the beet color and the vinegar and become something entirely different from what they had started as. Served cold in a small dish before supper, tart and sweet and beautiful. Root cellar cooking at its most intelligent, taking what the garden gave in abundance and transforming it into something that lasted and improved with time. Number 8, fatback popcorn. Dried field corn popped in a cast iron pot with rendered fatback instead of oil. The pork fat flavored every kernel as it popped, coating them in a savory, smoky film that no butter or commercial oil could replicate. Salted heavily and eaten from a bowl while the family gathered before supper. It cost essentially nothing in a household that had field corn drying in the barn and a piece of fatback in the smokehouse. It tasted like a completely different food from what we call popcorn today. Richer, more complex, more honest. The corn tasted like corn. The fat tasted like the pig. Together they tasted like a hillbilly kitchen in the 1970s on a cold evening when supper was still 20 minutes away. Number 7, pickled okra. Whole okra pods packed upright into mason jars with garlic cloves, dried red pepper, dill seed, and a hot vinegar brine poured over the top, sealed and left for 3 weeks. When you pulled one out of the jar, it was still firm and slightly crunchy, and the brine had gone all the way through it. Sour, garlicky, hot. Eaten one at a time from the jar, standing at the open refrigerator or root cellar door while supper finished. Mountain women across Kentucky and Tennessee put up dozens of jars of pickled okra every August, when the okra was coming in faster than it could be fried. The jars lasted through winter. The flavor did not diminish. It deepened. Number 6, cornbread croutons. Day-old cornbread cut into cubes and fried in bacon grease until each cube was crisp on all sides and had absorbed enough fat to taste deeply savory. eaten from a bowl with a pinch of salt, or crumbled into a glass of cold buttermilk and eaten with a spoon. Nothing was wasted. The cornbread that was too dry to eat at supper became the thing you ate before the next supper. This is the logic of a kitchen that could not afford waste and refused to accept that old food was lesser food. Cornbread croutons were not a recipe. They were a philosophy. Use what you have. Transform what would otherwise be thrown away. Eat it standing up because it is too good to wait. Number 5, fried morel mushrooms. Morel mushrooms emerge from the forest floor in Appalachia in April and May, and finding them was treated as a minor miracle, something to be celebrated and eaten immediately. Halved, soaked in salted water to clear them, then dredged in flour or cornmeal, and fried in butter until golden. They smelled of the forest floor and tasted of something deeply savory and complex that had no precise name. Country families who knew where to look for them guarded their morel spots the way other families guarded recipes. Fried morels were set on the table as soon as they came out of the skillet and were gone before the skillet cooled. A seasonal thing, a precious thing, almost entirely forgotten now that the forests where they grew have shrunk. Number 4, black walnuts with salt. Black walnuts gathered from the forest floor in autumn, hulled by hand, which stained the fingers dark brown for a week, cracked open and picked from the shell, eaten with nothing but a pinch of salt. Black walnuts taste completely different from the English walnuts in grocery stores. Stronger, more bitter, more complex, more deeply themselves. Mountain families gathered them by the bushel because they were free and kept through winter in a cool, dry place. Set in a bowl on the table before supper, cracked open at the table by whoever had the patience for it. The flavor was an acquired taste that, once acquired, made the mild grocery store walnut seem like a pale imitation of the real thing. Number 3, persimmon leather. Wild persimmons gathered after the first frost when they had finally lost their astringency and become intensely sweet, cooked down into a thick paste and spread onto cloth or boards to dry in the sun or near the wood stove until firm enough to peel off and eat in strips. Sweet and concentrated and faintly spiced by the fruit's own natural flavor. Mountain children ate it like candy. Adults ate it before supper because it was sweet and filling and cost nothing to make from a fruit that grew wild on the hillsides. Persimmon leather required patience, the gathering, the cooking, the drying, but the result was something that tasted like the distilled sweetness of an Appalachian autumn. Almost no one makes it anymore. Number 2, fried salt pork strips. Thick slices of salt pork fried in a dry skillet until the fat rendered out, and the strips became crisp and dark and intensely salty. Eaten hot from the skillet while supper finished cooking. They tasted like bacon's more serious older brother, saltier, meatier, with a chew that required attention. A piece of salt pork cost almost nothing at the country store in 1971. It kept without refrigeration in a brine barrel or a smokehouse. It flavored everything that went into the pot with it, and when you fried the strips themselves, what came out was something that required no accompaniment and no apology. Salt pork built this country. It fed the people who built this country. We have forgotten both. Number 1, hot water cornbread with sorghum. Hot water cornbread in the simplest version, just cornmeal and boiling water and salt, formed into small cakes by hand, and fried until the outside was dark and hard. set on a plate with a small jar of sorghum molasses beside it. You broke the cake and dipped it directly into the sorghum. The bitterness of the charred cornmeal crust met the deep, dark sweetness of the sorghum and produced something that tasted like it had been developed by a careful cook over many years of refinement, not something made in 4 minutes from 2 ingredients. Mountain mothers across Kentucky and Tennessee made this for 3, 4, 5 generations in a row without writing it down. The hands knew. The sorghum lasted in the jar through winter. The cornmeal was always in the crock. And when someone was hungry before supper was ready, this was what appeared on the table without discussion. They did not call it an appetizer. They called it something to hold you. It held generations. The kitchens that produced these 25 appetizers are almost all gone now. The wood-burning stoves have been replaced. The root cellars have been filled in. The women who knew how to make persimmon leather and Shucky beans and hot water cornbread without a recipe are leaving us, one season at a time. And what they knew, the knowledge that lived in their hands and their instincts and their understanding of what a cold winter required and what a hungry family deserved, is going with them. These were not appetizers in the way the word is used today. They were not a first course designed to stimulate the appetite before a more important meal. They were the overflow of a working kitchen, the things that came off the stove first, or came out of the root cellar, or came off the hillside, because supper was not ready, and the hunger in that house was real and immediate. They were made by women who understood that nothing was too simple to make well, and nothing was too humble to be worth eating with attention. They were right. They were always right. Tell me in the comments which one your grandmother made. Tell me which hillbilly kitchen you grew up in, and what came off that stove before supper was ready. Because these were not just appetizers. They were proof that a cast iron skillet, a handful of cornmeal, and someone who knew what she was doing could feed a family something worth remembering. And we are running out of time to remember it. If this brought back even one memory of a hillbilly kitchen you knew, subscribe to the Vanished Kitchen right now, because next week we go back to the table again, and you do not want to miss what we find there. The Vanished Kitchen. Some flavors deserve to be remembered.